Ombudsman John Nakuta via Skype. Good morning and thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning and thank you for having me, and also good morning to your viewers.
Just perhaps to start with, Mr. Nakuta, you can tell me what your overall...
You can hear me well, because I must admit my volume is not so good. I don't know what is it.
Can you hear me?
Can you hear me properly?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
All right. Let's start with your overall impression on news reporting in the Namibian media sphere, and I'm talking television, radio, print. What is your impression?
Right. Maybe first things first, Nina, if you don't mind, before answering your questions, I would very much like to start by congratulating the government and the people of Namibia for having retained the #1 position of being the freest press in Africa and number 23 in the world, as rated and announced in yesterday's 2020 World Press Freedom Index. This is indeed no small achievement, and of course it's something worth celebrating. But I would also at the same time caution that we shouldn't become too complacent with our achievement and not address some of the other pressing issues that are still there in our country. So, for example, amongst others, the promulgation of an access to information legislation in Namibia, or Access to Information Act in Namibia, it's still very much outstanding. And so these are some of the things that must still be discussed, addressed, but that is obviously not the place to go into detail about that.
So your overall impression then is that...
To come back to your question.
Yes.
How would I rate news reporting in Namibia? Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes, that is correct.
Yes. I would, in answering that, I would make mention of some of the things that I've highlighted in my report as the media ombudsman for last year, at the end of the year and early in the beginning of this year, and to mention that some of the most complaints that was lodged with the media ombudsman last year and even at the beginning of this year relates to inaccurate reporting, truthfulness of publications, and the right to reply, objectivity, and partial reporting. And of course, this is concerning because it goes against the core principles of ethical journalism, specifically also in our context, clause 2.1 of the Code of Ethics and Conduct governing the media in Namibia, which specifically requires that the media shall take care to report truthfully, accurately, and fairly. So that in a nutshell, I would say, is my impression about news reporting in Namibia.
What we're trying to dissect today is the issue of fake news, and that it's on the rise. Would you say that there is a trend that fake news is indeed increasing, and also what constitutes as, to be considered as fake news?
Well, what was the first question? I must admit, it's like, as I said, the quality of the sound is not so good. The first part of the question was what?
Was that there's a trend that seemingly shows that fake news is on the rise. Is this a correct observation? And also then what constitutes as fake news?
Well, obviously fake news is very much on the rise, especially if one can use the COVID-19 situation as an example. The amount and prevalence of misinformation, disinformation that is there with regard to COVID-19 is really alarming, and it's very, very much concerning. So certainly it is on the increase.
We see a lot of...
As to what constitute fake news, actually, I've read something that experts are recommending that we should actually avoid the use of the term fake news. because it is very limited in scope. Fake news is said to be mainly associated with politics, and this association can unhelpfully narrow the focus of the issues. And for that, experts rather preferring to talk about false information, because false information obviously deals with a much broader range of issues such as health, environmental issues, economic issues, at all platforms and genres, while fake news, as I said, is much more narrowly understood as political news stories. Thus, if you may, the question, in my opinion, should more rather be, what is false information? And false information is news, stories, and hoaxes created to deliberately misinform or deceive readers. And of course, these stories are created to either influence people's views, push a political agenda, or cause confusion, and can often be a profitable business for online publishers. False information can deceive people by looking like trusted websites or using similar names and web addresses to reputable news organizations. So that, in short, in my view, would be my answer to your question of what constitutes fake news. And for me, very interestingly, the regulations as published under the state of emergency, regulation number 16 in particular, doesn't talk about fake news. It talks about the spreading of false information. So it is basically consistent with this view of experts that we should avoid talking about fake news and rather speak about false information.
Very well. Now, it would seem that the easiest platform to spread this false information on would be social media platforms. Why do you think social media is such an easier target as opposed to other forms of media?
Well, in my opinion, of course, social media is unregulated. Traditionally, we got our news from trusted sources, journalists, and media outlets that are required to follow strict codes and practices. However, the internet has enabled a whole new way to publish, share, or consume information with news with very little regulation or editorial standards. And that in itself makes it so much easier and makes social media, of course, the preferred way to, so to speak, as a way to perpetuate and spread fake news.
Mr. Nakuta, perhaps you can tell us, and also for our viewers this morning, which I think is very important, is how to distinguish that the information you're receiving via social media platforms is indeed false information.
I would say there are a few things to look at. The first one is like, look at the source, question the source. Is this news that I'm reading or this that has been sent to me, is it from a reputable or a reliable source? So the question one is question the source. The other one is also about the logo. We have seen it that some organizations' logos are used. Some logos are used that looks the same as an official website. And we have seen it, it's like even in our context, and we've seen, it's like, I remember, for example, sometime last year, a letter was purportedly sent and it pretended to be being issued by the Prime Minister, giving certain tribal group I think leave to go and attend some very important cultural activity in the north or cultural ritual in the north, and it was only meant for that. And it was issued under the banner, so to speak, of the office by the Prime Minister. But that letter was not even signed and whatever. And some people believed that. And it turned out to be fake. So that's why it is very necessary to look at the logo of this news item that you are reading. The next one is also the language used, because it goes without saying that credible journalists and organizations are less likely to make repeated spelling and grammar mistakes, because many a times some of these things that you are reading, you can clearly tell that, but how could someone be so sloppy in terms of the language uses and whatever. So that's why it's very important to also consider and to try and spot what is the language usage in this whatever. Another one is the over-encouragement to share. They are saying, be wary if the message presses you to share, because this is how viral messaging works. It's like you are urged to share this thing and whatever, spread it with friends. And of course, the last one is to fact check. And in this case, I would recommend that Namibia, that websites such as Namibia Fact Check and Africa Check must be consulted so as to verify whether or not what I'm reading is really what it pretends to be.
With the amendment of the state of emergency regulations, we've now seen that spreading false information concerning COVID-19 is now a criminal offense. Would you say that this is a good call from the state?
Well, I know there are people that are having different views on this issue. But maybe to begin with, as we just said, the increase of fake news is really very concerning. In fact, the director of the World Health Organization has termed it and labeled it as an infodemic. Fake news, in other words, spread much faster and much more easily today through the internet, social media, as we know, and instant messaging. And these messages may contain useless, incorrect, or even harmful information and advice, which can hamper the public health response and add to social disorder and division. And in the words of UNESCO that I've read yesterday, actually put the lives of many people at risk. So in a way, there is certainly justification for curbing the spread of the pandemic in the way we have seen in the regulations. And maybe I should add to that the right to freedom of expression, like any other right, is not absolute. It is, in the context of Namibia, it is subject to limitation and restrictions in terms of Article 22 of the Namibian Constitution, and it also capable of being derogated, in other words, suspended under very specific circumstances in terms of Article 24, sub-article 3 of the Namibian Constitution. But it is not just a question of standing up and restricting the right to freedom of expression, as we have seen. There are very specific criteria which must be complied with whenever any right is restricted or limited. And if you allow me, very quickly, there are three that I quickly would want to highlight. The criteria for limiting the right to freedom of expression, as we've seen with the criminalization of spreading of false news, is it must be done by a law of general application. And the regulations or the regulations that has been proclamated constitute a law of general application. Secondly, the limitation must pursue a legitimate purpose. I've just mentioned that UNESCO has indicated that the spread of false news is very, very dangerous and put the lives of a lot of people in danger. So something needs to be done. So it comes across then, therefore, that the limitation placed on the right to freedom of expression in the form of the criminalization of false news seems to pursue a legitimate purpose. And last but not least, it must be necessary and in conformity with the principle of proportionality. As I said, it seems that this is really something that needs to be done because it's becoming a almost, as we said, in the words of the World Health Organization, an infodemic. And in terms of proportionality, looks at the issue is are we using a hammer to crack a nut? That kind of a balanced process that must be considered. And it seems that under the circumstances, it seems proportionate to what the aim is to achieve here. So in a way, I would then say that it is justifiable and reasonable under the circumstances.
Thank you so much for your time this morning. It was lovely speaking to you.
Thank you very much.
That was Mr. John Nakuta, Media Ombudsman, speaking to us this morning as we dissect the issue of fake news during COVID-19. We know that with the amendment of the Namibian state of emergency, spreading false information or fake news concerning COVID-19 during this time is now a criminal offense. He gave us tips on how to make sure that we are able to identify false information on social media and other platforms, and that is always to verify your source, the logo from which this news comes from, also the language used in the statement or information that's coming forth, and then lastly, it's very important to fact check all information.